The scorching desert sun beat down mercilessly on the sleek luxury car as it sped along the winding road. Behind the wheel sat Rashid Al-Mansour, his knuckles white with tension as he gripped the steering wheel. The successful Arab businessman was racing against time, trying to make it back to his vast date palm estate before an important video conference with international investors. Rashid's mind wandered to his young son Zayn, waiting for him at home. A pang of guilt struck him as he realized he had barely spent any time with the boy lately. His empire of date palms and lucrative business deals had consumed his life, leaving little room for family. He made a mental note to carve out some quality time with Zayn soon. Lost in thought, Rashid almost missed the first hints of the approaching sandstorm. A swirling haze appeared on the horizon, growing larger by the second. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield as visibility rapidly decreased. The once clear sky turned an ominous orange-brown. "Not now," Rashid muttered, pressing down harder on the accelerator. If he could just outrun the storm and make it to the next town. But nature had other plans. The wind howled, pelting the car with sand and small rocks. Rashid's knuckles turned white as he fought to maintain control of the vehicle. The road ahead disappeared into a vortex of swirling dust. In a heart-stopping moment, the car hit a patch of loose sand. Rashid felt the wheels losing traction, the vehicle starting to slide sideways. He turned the steering wheel frantically, but it was too late. The world spun in a dizzying blur as the car flipped once, twice, before coming to rest. On its side with a sickening crunch of metal. Silence fell, broken only by the relentless howling of the wind. Hours later, as the storm finally began to subside, a group of Bedouin travelers stumbled upon the wreckage. They found Rashid unconscious, barely clinging to life. With practiced efficiency, they carefully extracted him from the mangled vehicle and loaded him onto one of their camels. "We must get him to the city hospital immediately," the group's leader declared. "Allah willing, he will survive." As they set off across the desert, none of them could have imagined how this chance encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just Rashid's life, but the lives of everyone connected to him. Meanwhile, back at Rashid's sprawling estate, 8-year-old Zayn sat by the window of his opulent bedroom, eyes scanning the driveway for any sign of his father's car. The boy's small face was a mask of quiet resignation. He was used to his father's prolonged absences, but that didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. A knock on the door interrupted his vigil. "Master Zayn," called the clipped voice of Mrs. Fatima, the stern housekeeper. "It's time for your evening lessons." Zayn sighed, reluctantly leaving his post by the window. His days were a rigid schedule of tutors, meals at precise times, and strictly monitored play sessions. The army of staff that ran the household treated him with detached politeness, but there was no warmth in their interactions. As he trudged down the hallway, Zayn caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar face, a young woman carrying cleaning supplies. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered him a small, genuine smile. It was such a stark contrast to the usual formal nods he received that Zayn found himself smiling back before he even realized it. "Amira!" Mrs. Fatima's sharp voice made them both jump. "You're here to work, not socialize. Get back to the laundry room immediately." The young woman, Amira, ducked her head apologetically and hurried away. Zayn watched her go, a small spark of curiosity kindling in his chest. There was something different about her, a warmth that seemed out of place. In the cold efficiency of the household, little did either of them know that their brief encounter was the first thread in a tapestry that would soon begin to weave their lives together in ways they could never have imagined. As night fell, the estate's tranquility was shattered by the shrill ring of the telephone. Mrs. Fatima answered, her face growing pale as she listened to the voice on the other end. With trembling hands, she replaced the receiver and gathered the senior staff. "There's been an accident," she announced, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "Mr. Al-Mansour's car was found in the desert. He's been taken to Capital City Hospital in critical condition." A ripple of shock ran through the assembled staff. For all his absences, Rashid Al-Mansour was the heart of the estate, the force that kept everything running. What would happen Now? What about the young master? Someone asked. Mrs. Fatima's lips thinned into a tight line. For now, we say nothing to the boy. We'll maintain his routine as usual until we know more. As the staff dispersed to their duties, whispering urgently among themselves, no one noticed the small figure huddled in the shadows of the grand staircase. Zayn had overheard everything, his young mind struggling to process the implications of what he'd heard. In that moment, Zayn's world shifted on its axis. The certainties of his life, as lonely and regimented as it had been, suddenly felt as unstable as the desert sands. He retreated to his room, curling up on his massive, four-poster bed, feeling smaller and more alone than ever before. Across the estate, in the humble servants' quarters, Amira settled into her narrow bed, unaware of the drama unfolding in the main house. Her mind drifted to the solemn-faced little boy she'd seen earlier. There was something in his eyes, a profound sadness that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders to bear. As she drifted off to sleep, Amira had no idea that her path was about to intersect with Zayn's, in a way that would change both their lives forever. The wheels of fate had been set in motion, and the sands of the desert were about to witness a story of unexpected connections, personal growth, and the transformative power of compassion. In the distance, the wind whispered across the dark expanse of date palms, carrying with it the promise of change. The stage was set for a tale that would challenge assumptions, bridge divides, and prove that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. The following days at the Al Mansour estate unfolded in a haze of hushed whispers and tense uncertainty. The staff moved through their duties like ghosts, their usual efficiency tinged with an undercurrent of worry. Young Zayn, keenly aware of the shift in atmosphere, withdrew further into himself, spending long hours staring out the window at the swaying date palms. Mrs. Fatima, the housekeeper, struggled to maintain order in the face of the crisis. Her ironclad routines, once the backbone of the household, now felt hollow and inadequate. It was during one particularly stressful morning that she made a decision that would alter the course of events in ways she could never have predicted. "Amira," she called sharply, spotting the young maid dusting in the hallway. "Come here at once." Amira approached cautiously, wondering if she had somehow displeased the stern housekeeper. Mrs. Fatima's next words, however, caught her completely off guard. "You're to look after young Master Zayn from now on," Mrs. Fatima announced, her tone brooking no argument. "His regular nanny has taken ill, and we're short-staffed as it is. You'll see to his meals, supervise his study time, and keep him occupied." Amira's eyes widened in surprise. "But Mrs. Fatima, I'm not trained as a—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Fatima cut her off. "You're young, you have energy. Surely you can handle one child, unless you'd prefer to return to your village." The threat was clear. Amira swallowed hard, thinking of her family back home and the meager wages she sent them each month. This job, however daunting, was her lifeline. "No, Mrs. Fatima," she said quietly. "I'll do my best." "See that you do," the housekeeper replied, curtly before sweeping away, leaving Amira standing in the hallway, her mind reeling with the enormity of her new responsibility. Meanwhile, in his cavernous bedroom, Zayn sat cross-legged on the floor, half-heartedly pushing a toy car back and forth. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up, expecting to see his usual nanny with her perpetual frown of disapproval. Instead, it was the young woman he'd seen in the hallway days earlier. She stood in the doorway, a tentative smile on her face. "Hello, Master Zayn," Amira said gently. "My name is Amira. I'll be looking after you for a while." Zayn regarded her warily, years of emotional distance making him hesitant to engage, but there was something in Amira's warm brown eyes that made him want to trust her, just a little. "Where's Ms. Haddad?" he asked, referring to his regular nanny. "She's not feeling well," Amira explained, kneeling down to his level. "So you're stuck with me for now. I hope that's okay." For the first time in days, a ghost of a smile flickered across Zayn's face. "I guess so," he said softly. Amira's heart melted at the sight of the boy's tentative smile. In that moment, she made a silent vow to herself. She would do everything in her power to bring light back into this child's eyes. "Well then," she said brightly, "what shall we do today? I heard you have quite the collection of books. Maybe you could show me your favorites." As Zayn hesitantly began to show Amira his prized possessions, neither of them could have imagined how this simple interaction would be the first step on a journey that would transform them both. Days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, a bond began to form between Amira and Zayn. Where the previous nanny had been all strict schedules and rote learning, Amira brought creativity and warmth to their interactions. She turned lessons into games, found ways to make even the driest subjects engaging, and most importantly, she listened. For the first time in his young life, Zayn felt truly seen and heard. Amira didn't dismiss his questions or fears. Instead, she encouraged his curiosity and validated his feelings. When he finally worked up the courage to ask about his father, Amira didn't brush him off with platitudes. "Your father is very ill," she explained gently, holding his small hand in hers. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help him get better. It's okay to feel scared or sad about it." Zayn's lower lip trembled. Do you think he'll come back?" Amira's heart ached for the vulnerable child before her. "I hope so, with all my heart," she said softly. "And while we wait, we'll be brave together, okay?" It was a turning point in their relationship. From that day forward, Zayn began to open up more, sharing his thoughts and dreams with Amira. She, in turn, told him stories of her village, of the simple joys and struggles of life outside the palatial walls of the estate. One particularly memorable afternoon, Amira decided it was time for Zayn to experience more of the world beyond his gilded cage. With some careful maneuvering to avoid Mrs. Fatima's watchful eye, she smuggled the boy out to the estate's vast date palm groves. Zayn's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in the towering trees, their fronds swaying gently in the desert breeze. Amira showed him how to identify ripe dates, laughing as he bit into one with gusto, juice dribbling down his chin. "My father says these palms have been here for generations," Zayn said, a note of pride in his voice. "They're amazing," Amira agreed. "Did you know that date palms can live for over 100 years? They're like the wise old guardians of the desert." As they walked among the trees, Amira began to tell Zayn about the rich cultural significance of date palms in their region. She spoke of ancient traditions, of how dates had sustained desert dwellers for millennia, and how the trees were seen as symbols of resilience and life. Zayn listened, enraptured. For the first time, he began to see his family's legacy as more than just a business. There was a depth and beauty to it that he'd never appreciated before. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Amira and Zayn sat beneath a gnarled old palm tree. The boy leaned against her, a contentment settling over him that he'd rarely felt before. "Amira," he said softly, "I'm glad you're here." Amira felt her eyes mist over as she hugged the child close. "I'm glad too, Zayn, more than you know." What neither of them realized was that their afternoon adventure had not gone unnoticed. From a window in the main house, Mrs. Fatima had observed their excursion with narrowed eyes. The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched. The pair's easy familiarity. This, she decided, would need to be addressed. The last thing the household needed was for the young master to become too attached to a mere servant, especially now, with Mr. Al-Mansour's condition still uncertain and the future of the estate hanging in the balance. As Amira and Zayn made their way back to the house, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon, the setting sun cast long shadows across the date palm grove. The ancient trees stood silent, bearing witness to the unfolding drama. A story of unexpected connections, looming conflicts, and the transformative power of compassion in the face of adversity. Little did they know that their budding bond would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. As the ripples of change set in motion by Rashid Al-Mansour's accident continued to spread, touching lives and altering destinies across the sun-baked landscape. As the weeks turned into months, life at the Al-Mansour estate settled into a new rhythm. Zayn, once withdrawn and melancholy, now moved through his days with a newfound spark of curiosity and joy. Amira's presence had awakened something in the boy, a zest for life that had long lain dormant beneath the weight of his gilded but lonely existence. Their days were filled with impromptu adventures and learning experiences that went far beyond the rigid curriculum of his former tutors. Amira taught Zayn about the flora and fauna of the desert, regaled him with folk tales passed down through generations, and even introduced him to simple cooking, much to the chagrin of the estate's professional chef. However, not everyone viewed these changes with a benevolent eye. Mrs. Fatima, in particular, watched the growing bond between Amira and Zayn with increasing concern. The housekeeper had served the Al-Mansour family for decades, and she considered herself the guardian of tradition and propriety within the household. One afternoon, as Amira and Zayn returned from another of their expeditions, this time to a small oasis not far from the estate, Mrs. Fatima intercepted them in the grand foyer. "Amira," she said, her voice clipped and cold, "a word, if you please." Zayn looked up at Amira, sensing the tension. She gave him a reassuring smile. "Why don't you go wash up for dinner, Zayn? I'll see you in a bit." As the boy reluctantly trudged up the stairs, Amira turned to face Mrs. Fatima, steeling herself for the confrontation she had long feared was coming. "I'm concerned about the liberties you've been taking with young Master Zayn," Mrs. Fatima began, her eyes narrowing. "These excursions are highly irregular, and I've noticed you've been neglecting some of your other duties." Amira took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "Mrs. Fatima, I understand your concerns, but Zayn has been flourishing. He's happier, more engaged." "That is not for you to decide," Mrs. Fatima cut her off sharply. "You were brought here to care for the boy, not to usurp the role of his family or to neglect your other responsibilities. Remember your place, girl. You are here to serve, nothing more." The words stung, but Amira stood her ground. "With all due respect, Mrs. Fatima, I believe that truly caring for Zayn means nurturing his spirit as well as seeing to his physical needs. Mr. Al-Mansour entrusted us with his son's well-being, and I'm doing my best to honor that trust." For a moment, something flickered in Mrs. Fatima's eyes, a mix of surprise and perhaps a grudging respect, but it was quickly replaced by her usual stern demeanor. "Just see that you don't overstep your bounds," she warned before sweeping away. Amira leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. She knew she was walking a fine line, but the thought of reverting to the cold, regimented care that Zayn had known before was unbearable. She had to find a way to navigate this complex household dynamic while still being true to the connection she'd forged with the boy. Meanwhile, unknown to both Amira and Mrs. Fatima, Zayn had lingered at the top of the stairs, overhearing much of their conversation. A familiar sense of dread settled in his stomach. Would Amira be sent away? Would he be forced back into the sterile routine of his former life? That night, as Amira tucked Zayn into bed, she sensed his unease. "What's troubling you, little one?" she asked gently. Zayn bit his lip, then blurted out, "Are you going to leave me?" Amira's heart clenched. She sat on the edge of his bed, taking his small hand in hers. "Zayn, listen to me. I can't promise what the future holds, but I want you to know something. No matter what happens, the bond we've formed, it's real, it's precious, and it's not something anyone can take away from us. Okay?" Zayn nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Amira hugged him close, wishing she could shield him from the complexities of the adult world that threatened to intrude on their sanctuary. As Zayn drifted off to sleep, Amira made her way to her small room in the servants' quarters. She pulled out a worn notebook and began to write, as she had every night since coming to the estate. These letters, addressed to Rashid Al-Mansour, but never sent, had become her confidant, a way to process her thoughts and feelings about her unexpected role in this household. "Dear Mr. Al-Mansour," she wrote, her pen moving swiftly across the page. "Your son laughed today. A real, unbridled laugh that seemed to bubble up from his very soul. We were trying to fly a kite in the date palm grove, and it kept getting tangled in the branches. Instead of getting frustrated, Zayn found it hilarious. In that moment, I saw a glimpse of the carefree child he could be, free from the weight of expectations and loneliness. I know my methods are unorthodox. I know I'm probably overstepping my role, but sir, if you could see the light in your son's eyes, I believe with all my heart that this is what he needs, not just lessons and schedules, but joy and wonder and the freedom to simply be a child. I hope that when you recover, and I pray every day that you will, you'll understand, that you'll see the amazing person your son is becoming. He misses you terribly, but he's also finding his own strength. I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to nurture that strength to help Zayn become the remarkable man I know he can be. Amira paused, her pen hovering over the paper. There was so much more she wanted to say, about her own growing attachment to Zayn, about her fears for the future, about the conflicting emotions she felt towards a man she'd never met, but whose absence had so profoundly shaped her life these past months. Instead, she simply wrote, "I hope that one day I'll be able to share these letters with you. Until then, know that your son is loved, cherished, and growing in ways that would make any father proud." As she closed the notebook, Amira gazed out her small window at the starlit sky. The vastness of the desert stretched out before her, a reminder of both the insignificance of their daily dramas and the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. Little did she know that far away in the city hospital, Rashid Al-Mansour's fingers had twitched for the first time in months. The doctors exchanged excited glances, daring to hope that their patient might finally be emerging from his prolonged, unconscious state. As the night deepened, the Al-Mansour estate stood silent under the watchful gaze of the ancient date palms. Within its walls, a delicate web of relationships, hopes, and fears continued to evolve. And somewhere in the distance, the winds of change were gathering strength, promising to sweep through their lives with unstoppable force. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky when Dr. Fawaz burst into the hospital room. His eyes alight with a mixture of excitement and professional caution. Rashid Al-Mansour, the man who had lain motionless for months, was showing unmistakable signs of emerging from his comatose state. "Mr. Al-Mansour," Dr. Fawaz called out, his voice clear and firm. "If you can hear me, try to squeeze my hand." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, ever so slightly, Rashid's fingers twitched and curled around the doctor's hand. A collective gasp went up from the medical team gathered around the bed. It was a small gesture, but one loaded with monumental significance. Over the next few days, Rashid's progress was slow but steady. His eyes flickered open, unfocused at first, but gradually regaining awareness of his surroundings. Speech came haltingly, his voice raspy from disuse. But with each passing hour, more of the man he had been before the accident seemed to resurface. As Rashid's fog of unconsciousness lifted, his first coherent thoughts were of his son. "Zayn," he croaked, his eyes wild with concern. "Where is Zayn?" Dr. Fawaz placed a calming hand on his patient's shoulder. "Your son is safe, Mr. Al-Mansour. He's been well cared for at your estate, but you need to focus on your recovery now. There will be time for reunions soon." Meanwhile, back at the Al-Mansour estate, life continued its delicate dance of new routines and simmering tensions. Amira and Zayn had settled into a rhythm that brought out the best in both of them. The boys' natural curiosity, once stifled by rigid expectations, now blossomed under Amira's nurturing guidance. One sun-drenched afternoon found them in the estate's vast library, a room Zayn had rarely entered before Amira's arrival. Now it had become one of their favorite retreats. Amira was reading aloud from an old book of Arabian folk tales, her voice bringing the ancient stories to life. And so, she concluded, the clever merchant outsmarted the 40 thieves, proving that wit and wisdom are often more powerful than brute strength. Zayn, sprawled on a plush carpet at her feet, looked up with shining eyes. "Do you think I could be that clever someday, Amira?" She smiled warmly at him. "Zayn, I think you're already that clever. You just need to believe in yourself." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sharp click of heels on marble. Mrs. Fatima appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of barely contained agitation. "Amira," she said, her voice clipped. "A word, please. In private." Zayn's face fell, sensing the tension. Amira gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before following Mrs. Fatima into the hallway. Once they were out of earshot, Mrs. Fatima turned to face Amira, her expression grave. "There's been a development," she said, her voice low. "Mr. Al-Mansour has regained consciousness." Amira's heart leapt into her throat. This was the moment they had all been hoping for, praying for. But now that it had arrived, she found herself flooded with conflicting emotions. Joy for Zayn, certainly, but also a creeping sense of uncertainty about what this might mean for her own place in the household. "That's wonderful news," she managed to say. "When will he be coming home?" Mrs. Fatima's lips thinned. "That remains to be seen. His recovery will take time. But make no mistake, things will change around here. Mr. Al-Mansour will undoubtedly have his own ideas about his son's care and education." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Amira straightened her spine, meeting Mrs. Fatima's gaze steadily. "I understand. My priority, as always, is Zayn's well-being. I'll do whatever is best for him." Mrs. Fatima nodded curtly. "See that you do. And Amira, it might be wise to start preparing the boy for his father's return. We wouldn't want him to become too attached to temporary arrangements." As Mrs. Fatima swept away, Amira leaned against the wall, her mind reeling. How could she possibly prepare Zayn for such a monumental shift? And how could she protect her own heart in the process? Back in the library, Zayn was paging through the book of folk tales, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. When Amira returned, he looked up at her with worried eyes. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "Did I do something wrong?" Amira's heart melted at his concern. She knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers. "No, Zayn, you've done nothing wrong. In fact, I have some news that I think will make you very happy." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Your father, he's woken up, he's getting better." Zayn's eyes widened, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. Joy, relief, but also a hint of apprehension. "He's really coming back," he whispered. "Yes, little one, he is." Amira pulled him into a gentle hug, feeling him tremble slightly in her arms. "It's okay to feel a lot of things right now. Happy, scared, excited, it's all normal." As she held him, Amira's own emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She had grown to love this child as if he were her own, and the thought of stepping back, of potentially losing this connection they had forged, was almost unbearable. But she knew she had to be strong, for Zayn's sake. This was a crucial moment in his young life, and she was determined to help him navigate it with as much grace and understanding as possible. "Zayn," she said softly, pulling back to look him in the eye, "no matter what happens, I want you to remember something. The time we've spent together, the things we've learned and shared, that's all real. It's a part of you now, and nothing can take that away." Zayn nodded solemnly, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Will you still be here when he comes back?" Amira's heart clenched. "I don't know what the future holds, Zayn, but I promise you this. No matter where I am, you'll always have a friend in me. Always." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the library windows, Amira and Zayn sat together in comfortable silence. Both were lost in thought, contemplating the changes that lay ahead. Outside, the ancient date palms swayed gently in the evening breeze, silent witnesses to the ebb and flow of human lives and emotions. In the hospital miles away, Rashid Al-Mansour drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with images of his son and the home he had been absent from for so long. As he slowly regained his strength, he found himself increasingly eager to return, to reconnect with Zayn, and to reclaim his place in the world he had built. Little did any of them know that Rashid's return would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and the true meaning of home. The day of Rashid Al-Mansour's return dawned bright and clear, the desert sun casting a golden glow over the sprawling estate. An air of nervous anticipation hung over the household as staff scurried about, making last-minute preparations for their master's homecoming. In his room, young Zayn stood before a full-length mirror, fidgeting with the collar of his crisp white thobe. Amira knelt beside him, gently adjusting the fabric. "Remember," she said softly, Your father has been through a lot. He might seem different at first, but he's still the same person who loves you very much." Zayn nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Will you be there when he arrives?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amira's heart clenched. She wanted nothing more than to stand by Zayn's side, to offer him support during this emotional moment. But she knew her place, at least in the eyes of others. "I'll be nearby," she promised. "But this moment is for you and your father. It's time for your family to be whole again." As the sound of approaching vehicles reached their ears, Zayn's small hand found Amira's, squeezing it tightly. She gave him an encouraging smile before gently guiding him towards the grand entrance hall. The estate's main doors swung open, revealing Rashid al-Mansour. He stood tall and proud, though leaning slightly on a cane, a subtle reminder of his ordeal. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, taking in every detail of his surroundings. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Then, with a choked cry of "Baba," Zayn rushed forward. Rashid knelt down, enveloping his son in a fierce embrace. From her position near the back of the room, Amira watched the reunion with a bittersweet ache in her chest. She was truly happy for Zayn, but she couldn't help feeling like an outsider intruding on a private moment. As Rashid released Zayn, his gaze swept the room, acknowledging the assembled staff with a nod. When his eyes fell on Amira, there was a flicker of curiosity, quickly masked by his usual businesslike demeanor. "Welcome home, sir." Mrs. Fatima stepped forward, ever the efficient housekeeper. "Everything has been prepared, according to your instructions." "Thank you, Mrs. Fatima," Rashid replied, his voice strong despite months of disuse. "I trust the estate has been running smoothly in my absence." "Of course, sir. Young Master Zayn has been well cared for, and all business matters have been handled as per your standing orders." Rashid nodded, but his attention was already back on his son. "Zayn," he said warmly, "why don't you show me around? I want to hear all about what you've been up to while I was away." As father and son walked off, Amira couldn't help but notice the spring in Zayn's step, the animated way he gestured as he began to tell his father about his recent adventures. It was a side of Zayn she had come to know well, but one that had been sadly absent in his interactions with Rashid before the accident. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Rashid spent hours closeted with his business managers, catching up on months of reports and decisions. Zayn hovered nearby, eager for any moment of his father's attention. It wasn't until late in the evening that Rashid finally had a moment to truly observe the changes in his household. Sitting in his study, a glass of water in hand, alcohol was still off limits due to his medication, he called for Mrs. Fatima. "I've noticed some differences in Zayn," he began without preamble. "He seems happier, more confident. What changed while I was away?" Mrs. Fatima hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The boy has flourished under his new caretaker, sir, a young woman named Amira. She has a unique approach to his education and care." Rashid's eyebrows rose. "Unique? How so?" "She encourages a great deal of outdoor activity, sir. Exploration of the estate grounds, impromptu science lessons among the date palms. She's even been teaching him cooking, of all things." Mrs. Fatima's tone made it clear what she thought of these unconventional methods. Rashid was silent for a long moment, processing this information. "And Zayn responds well to this, Amira?" "I'm afraid the boy has become quite attached to her, sir," Mrs. Fatima replied, a note of disapproval creeping into her voice. Rashid waved her concern away. "That's not necessarily a bad thing, Mrs. Fatima. A child needs warmth and affection as much as discipline and education." He paused, lost in thought. "I'd like to meet this Amira. Arrange it for tomorrow, will you?" As Mrs. Fatima left to carry out his instructions, Rashid turned to gaze out the window at the moonlit expanse of his date palm groves. He found himself both intrigued and slightly unsettled by the changes in his son and his household. Meanwhile, in her small room, Amira sat at her desk, pen poised over her notebook. She had grown accustomed to writing her nightly letters to Rashid, pouring out her thoughts and hopes for Zayn. Now, with the man himself just a few corridors away, she found herself at a loss for words. Finally, she began to write, "Dear Mr. Al-Mansour, welcome home. I know we haven't formally met, but I feel as though I know you through Zayn's stories and my time here at the estate. Your son has grown so much in these past months, not just in height, but in spirit and confidence. He has a curious mind and a kind heart, traits I'm sure he's inherited from you. I want you to know that every decision I've made in caring for Zayn has been with his best interests at heart. I know my methods may seem unconventional, but I truly believe that children thrive when given the freedom to explore and learn at their own pace. I hope that as you reconnect with Zayn, you'll see the wonderful person he's becoming, and I hope that in some small way, I've helped prepare him for your return. Wishing you a joyful reunion and a smooth recovery, Amira." She closed the notebook, knowing that like all the others, this letter would remain unsent, but the act of writing it had helped calm her nerves about the upcoming meeting with Rashid. As the estate settled into silence for the night, 3 people lay awake, their minds churning with thoughts of the future. Rashid, determined to bridge the gap with his son while maintaining control of his empire. Zayn, caught between joy at his father's return and fear of losing the warmth and freedom he'd found with Amira. And Amira herself, steeling her resolve to do what was best for Zayn, no matter the personal cost. The stage was set for a collision of worlds, tradition and innovation, duty and love, the expectations of the past and the possibilities of the future. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, none of them could have predicted the challenges and revelations that lay ahead. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Amira found herself standing outside Rashid Al-Mansour's study, her heart pounding in her chest. She smoothed down her modest dress, took a deep breath, and knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," came a strong voice from within. Amira stepped into the study, her eyes immediately drawn to the imposing figure behind the desk. Rashid Al-Mansour exuded an aura of power and authority, even seated. His piercing gaze seemed to look right through her, assessing and evaluating. "Ah, you must be Amira," he said, his tone neutral. "Please have a seat." As Amira sat down, she couldn't help but notice the opulence of the room. The rich wood paneling, the shelves lined with leather-bound books, the ornate Persian rug beneath her feet. It was a stark contrast to the simple world she had created with Zayn over the past months. "I understand you've been caring for my son during my absence," Rashid began, leaning back in his chair. "Tell me, what exactly has your role entailed?" Amira took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Mr. Al-Mansour, my primary focus has been Zayn's education and well-being, but I believe true education goes beyond textbooks and schedules. I've tried to nurture his natural curiosity, to help him see the world as a place full of wonder and opportunity." Rashid's eyebrows rose slightly. "And how precisely have you done this?" "We've explored the estate grounds, sir, used the date palm groves as a living classroom to learn about biology and agriculture. We've studied the stars at night, learning about navigation and ancient myths. I've encouraged Zayn to ask questions, to think critically, to see connections between different subjects." As Amira spoke, her initial nervousness faded, replaced by the passion she felt for her work with Zayn. Rashid listened intently, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Fatima mentioned you've been teaching my son to cook," he said when she finished. There was a hint of amusement in his voice. Amira nodded. "Yes, sir. I believe it's an important life skill, and it's also an excellent way to teach about chemistry, math, and cultural history." Rashid was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When he finally spoke, his words took Amira by surprise. "You care deeply for my son, don't you?" Amira met his gaze steadily. "I do, sir. Zayn is an extraordinary child. It's been an honor to be a part of his life." Something softened in Rashid's eyes. "I can see why he's grown so attached to you. Your methods are unconventional, to say the least. But I cannot argue with the results. Zayn seems happier and more confident than I've ever seen him." Relief washed over Amira, but it was short-lived. "However," Rashid continued, his tone growing serious, "we must consider the future. Zayn is the heir to a vast business empire. He needs to be prepared for the responsibilities that come with that position. Your exploratory approach to education, while admirable, may not be sufficient to equip him for the challenges ahead. Amira felt her heart sink, but she refused to back down. Mr. Al-Mansour, if I may, the skills Zayn is developing, critical thinking, creativity, adaptability, these are exactly what he'll need to lead in an ever-changing world. The business landscape of tomorrow may look very different from today's. Rashid's eyebrows shot up, clearly not accustomed to being challenged, but instead of anger, a glimmer of respect appeared in his eyes. You make a compelling argument, Amira. It's clear you've given this a great deal of thought. He paused, considering. I propose a compromise. We'll integrate some of your methods into a more structured curriculum. You'll continue to work with Zayn, but under the supervision of a traditional tutor. This way we can ensure he receives a well-rounded education that prepares him both for the business world and for life. Amira's heart soared. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was far better than she had dared to hope for. Thank you, Mr. Al-Mansour. I believe this approach will truly benefit Zayn. As she stood to leave, Rashid called out, One more thing, Amira. I'd like you to join Zayn and me for dinner this evening. I want to observe your interaction with my son firsthand. Amira nodded, a mix of excitement and apprehension swirling in her stomach. As she left the study, she couldn't help but feel that a significant hurdle had been cleared, but that greater challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anticipation. When evening finally arrived, Amira found herself seated at the grand dining table, Zayn to her left, and Rashid at the head of the table. The boy's eyes darted between his father and Amira, a hopeful smile playing on his lips. As the first course was served, Rashid turned to his son. Zayn, why don't you tell me about what you've been learning lately? Zayn's face lit up. Oh, Baba, Amira and I have been studying the water cycle. Did you know that the water in our oasis might have once been part of a glacier thousands of miles away? What followed was a lively discussion that ranged from environmental science to ancient trade routes, with Zayn eagerly sharing everything he had learned. Amira chimed in occasionally, gently guiding the conversation and encouraging Zayn to make connections between different topics. Rashid listened intently, his expression a mixture of pride and amazement. As the meal progressed, he found himself drawn into the discussion, sharing his own knowledge and experiences from his travels. By the time dessert was served, a traditional date pudding that Zayn proudly announced he had helped prepare, the atmosphere in the dining room had transformed. Gone was the formal stiffness that had characterized so many of the Al-Mansour family meals in the past. In its place was a warm, engaging dynamic that seemed to energize all three of them. As Zayn was led away to prepare for bed, Rashid turned to Amira, a new respect in his eyes. I must admit, I underestimated the impact of your approach. The way Zayn's mind works, the connections he makes, it's remarkable. Amira smiled, her heart swelling with pride for her young charge. Zayn has always had that potential, sir. He just needed the right environment to flourish. Rashid nodded thoughtfully, and you've provided that environment. I can see now why my son has grown so fond of you. He paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision. Amira, I'd like to offer you a more permanent position here at the estate. Not just as Zayn's caretaker, but as an educational consultant. Help us develop a curriculum that combines the best of traditional and progressive methods. Amira's eyes widened in surprise. This was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Mr. Al-Mansour, I'd be honored. As she left the dining room that night, Amira felt a sense of possibility she had never experienced before. She had come to the Al-Mansour estate as a simple maid, and now found herself in a position to potentially reshape the education of not just Zayn, but perhaps many other children in the future. But as she walked down the moonlit corridor, a shadow of doubt crept into her mind. She had won Rashid's approval, but at what cost? The intimacy of her bond with Zayn, the simple joys of their daily adventures. Would all that change now that she had an official role to play? And what of her own dreams, the ones she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge? As she prepared for bed that night, Amira found herself at a crossroads, caught between the promise of a brighter future and the fear of losing the precious connection she had forged with Zayn. Little did she know that the true tests of her resolve and of the bonds she had formed were yet to come. As the estate settled into silence, the wheels of change continued to turn, setting the stage for challenges that would shake the very foundations of the Al Mansour legacy. The weeks following Rashid's return brought a whirlwind of changes to the Al Mansour estate. True to his word, Rashid had implemented a new educational program for Zayn, one that blended Amira's innovative approaches with more traditional academic rigor. The young boy's days were now filled with a mix of structured lessons and exploratory activities, all under the watchful eye of both Amira and a newly hired tutor, Mr. Hassan. At first, the transition was smooth. Zayn thrived under the new system, his natural curiosity finding an outlet in both the formal lessons and the hands-on experiences Amira continued to provide. But as the days turned to weeks, subtle tensions began to emerge. One crisp morning, as Amira was preparing for a nature walk with Zayn, Mr. Hassan approached her with a concerned frown. "Miss Amira," he began, his tone polite but firm, "I must express my concerns about today's schedule. The time allocated for your excursion conflicts with Zayn's mathematics lesson." Amira felt a flicker of frustration. "Mr. Hassan, this walk is part of Zayn's biology curriculum. We're studying local plant adaptations to the desert climate. Surely that's just as important as—" "With all due respect," Mr. Hassan interrupted, "young Master Zayn's future responsibilities will require a strong foundation in mathematics and business principles. Perhaps we could reschedule your nature study for another time." Before Amira could respond, a small voice piped up from behind them. "Why can't we do both?" They turned to find Zayn standing there, his bright eyes darting between the two adults. "We could do math outside, couldn't we? Count the leaves, measure the heights of different plants." Amira's heart swelled with pride at Zayn's creative thinking. Mr. Hassan, however, looked skeptical. "Young master, while your idea is creative, it's not quite the rigorous approach we need for—" "I think it's an excellent suggestion," came a deep voice from the doorway. Rashid Al Mansour strode into the room, a thoughtful expression on his face. "In fact, I'd like to join you on this mathematical nature walk. It's been too long since I've toured the grounds properly." And so an unusual party set out that morning, Zayn practically bouncing with excitement, Amira beaming with quiet satisfaction, Mr. Hassan looking slightly bewildered, and Rashid observing it all with keen interest. As they walked among the date palms, Zayn's enthusiasm was infectious. He calculated the average number of fronds on each tree, estimated the height of the palms using the angle of the sun and basic trigonometry, and even initiated a discussion on the economic principles behind the estate's irrigation system. Rashid watched his son with growing amazement. This was a side of Zayn he had rarely seen before, confident, engaged, and thinking critically about the world around him. He caught Amira's eye and gave her a small nod of approval. As they returned to the main house, Rashid pulled Amira aside. "I must admit your methods continue to impress me. Zayn is flourishing in ways I never imagined possible." Amira smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Al Mansour, but I worry. The balance between traditional education and our more explorative approach is delicate. I fear that if we lean too heavily in either direction, Zayn may lose some of the joy he's found in learning." Rashid considered her words carefully. "You may be right. Perhaps it's time we reviewed our approach, made some adjustments." He paused, then added with a hint of a smile, "And please call me Rashid. I think we've moved beyond such formalities." That evening, as Amira was helping Zayn prepare for bed, the boy surprised her with a question. "Amira," he said hesitantly, "are you happy here?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Of course I am, Zayn. Why do you ask?" He shrugged, looking down at his hands. "It's just, things are different now. You don't seem to smile as much as you used to." Amira's heart clenched. She hadn't realized her inner turmoil had been so visible. "Oh, Zayn," she said softly, sitting beside him on the bed. "I am happy, truly. It's just that sometimes Grown-ups have to deal with complicated feelings, but that doesn't change how much I care about you or how much I enjoy our time together." Zayn nodded, seeming to accept her explanation. But as Amira left his room that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Later, in the privacy of her own quarters, Amira pulled out her notebook. Her nightly letters to Rashid had become less frequent since his return, but tonight she felt compelled to write, "Dear Rashid, today was a reminder of why I fell in love with teaching and with this place. Seeing Zayn's mind at work, watching him make connections between the world around him and the principles he's learning, it's nothing short of magical, but I find myself at a crossroads. The more integrated I become into Zayn's formal education, the more I fear losing the special bond we've formed. How do I balance my role as an educator with the emotional support he so clearly needs? And then there's you. Your approval means more to me than I ever expected it would. But with that comes a new set of complications. I find myself second-guessing my instincts, wondering if each decision I make is the right one in your eyes. I'm grateful for the opportunities you've given me, for the trust you've placed in me. But I can't help wondering, where do I fit in this new version of the Al Mansour household? And more importantly, how do I ensure that Zayn continues to thrive amidst all these changes? As always, these questions will remain between me and this page, but writing them down helps me find clarity, and for that, I thank you. Yours sincerely, Amira." As she closed her notebook, Amira gazed out her window at the starlit desert beyond. The vast expanse of sand and sky had once seemed like a metaphor for the limitless possibilities ahead of her. Now, it felt more like an uncertain terrain, full of hidden pitfalls and unexpected turns. Little did she know that far across the estate, Rashid Al Mansour sat in his study, wrestling with his own set of conflicting emotions. The business empire he had built was facing new challenges in the rapidly changing global economy. Investors were pushing for more sustainable practices, and competitors were embracing innovative technologies that threatened to leave traditional operations like his in the dust. As he pored over reports and projections, Rashid found his mind wandering to the morning's impromptu math lesson among the date palms. The creativity, the engagement, the sheer joy of learning he had witnessed in his son. It stirred something in him. A long-dormant spark of innovation, perhaps, or a reminder of the passion that had driven him to build his empire in the first place. Rashid leaned back in his chair, a plan beginning to form in his mind. It was risky, potentially revolutionary, and would likely face significant opposition from the old guard of his business associates. But if it worked, he reached for his phone, hesitating for just a moment before dialing. "Ahmad," he said when his chief of operations answered, "I need you to set up a series of meetings. It's time we brought the Al Mansour Group into the 21st century." As the estate settled into the quiet of night, three souls lay awake, each grappling with their own visions of the future. Zayn, dreaming of new adventures and discoveries. Amira, balancing on the knife edge between professional duty and personal attachment. And Rashid, poised to embark on a journey that would either secure his legacy or bring it crumbling down around him. The winds of change were blowing stronger now, carrying with them the promise of transformation and the threat of upheaval. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, none of them could have predicted the storms that lay ahead, or the unlikely alliances that would form in the face of adversity. The first rays of dawn found Rashid Al Mansour in his study, surrounded by stacks of documents and digital projections that represented the most ambitious business transformation in the estate's history. His plan to modernize the family's date palm operations was radical, integrating sustainable agricultural technologies, developing new export markets, and creating a comprehensive community development program. But radical plans rarely come without resistance. "This is madness," declared Ahmad bin Khalid, Rashid's longest-serving business advisor, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. Generations of tradition thrown away for these experimental ideas. Rashid remained calm, a stark contrast to Ahmad's emotional outburst. Tradition doesn't mean stagnation, my friend. The world is changing, we must change with it. The meeting had been going on for hours, with Ahmad and other senior advisors presenting increasingly heated arguments against Rashid's proposed innovations. At the center of the plan was a revolutionary approach to agricultural technology, community, engagement and sustainable farming practices, ideas that had first taken root during Rashid's conversations with Amira. As the discussions continued, Amira found herself caught in an unexpected role. Rashid had begun to consult her more frequently, valuing her perspective on education and community development. Her insights, born from her experiences with Zayn and her understanding of local village life, were proving invaluable. "Miss Amira," Ahmad said, turning to her with barely disguised disdain, "surely you understand that these are complex business matters beyond the realm of a domestic worker." Before Amira could respond, Rashid intervened. "Amira's perspective is precisely what we need. She understands the human element, something many of us have forgotten in our pursuit of profit." The tension in the room was palpable. Traditional business leaders versus a new, more holistic approach to enterprise. Amira felt the weight of expectation, knowing that her contributions could make or break Rashid's ambitious plan. Meanwhile, Zayn had become an unexpected ally in this transformation. His natural curiosity and the educational approach Amira had nurtured made him surprisingly perceptive. During a break in the meetings, he approached his father with a suggestion that left Rashid momentarily speechless. "Baba," Zayn said, spreading out a hand-drawn map of the estate, "what if we create a learning center here, where local children can learn about agriculture, technology and business, not just for our workers, but for the entire community?" Rashid exchanged a look with Amira. The boy's suggestion was remarkably similar to ideas they had discussed privately. It was a testament to the transformative power of the education Amira had been providing. But not everyone was supportive of these changes. Mrs. Fatima, the longtime housekeeper, watched the unfolding drama with growing concern. The carefully maintained order of the Al-Mansour household was being disrupted, and she feared losing her position in this new world. One evening, she confronted Amira in the kitchen. "You've changed everything," she said, her voice a mixture of accusation and grudging respect. "The young master, Mr. Rashid, the entire estate, nothing is the same since you arrived." Amira met her gaze steadily. "Change isn't always a bad thing, Mrs. Fatima. Sometimes it's necessary for growth." As the days passed, the proposed changes began to take shape. Local agricultural experts were consulted, technology firms were invited to present innovative solutions, and community leaders were brought into the planning process. But with innovation came risk. Some of Rashid's most conservative business partners began to withdraw their support. Whispers of doubt spread through business circles in the region. Was Rashid Al-Mansour losing his strategic touch? Had his time away during his medical recovery affected his judgment? Amira noticed the toll these challenges were taking on Rashid. Late one night, she found him in his study, looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making a mistake," he confessed, something he would never have done in front of his business associates. "These changes, they're not just about the business, they're about creating a different future for Zayn, for our community." Amira placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. "Courage isn't about being fearless," she said softly. "It's about believing in something bigger than yourself even when others doubt you." Their moment was interrupted by Zayn, who burst into the study with excitement. "Baba, Amira, I've been working on something." He spread out a detailed presentation, a comprehensive plan for community education and agricultural innovation that showed a depth of understanding far beyond his years. Rashid and Amira exchanged a look of shared pride and wonder. The boy was becoming a bridge between tradition and innovation, between the world as it was and as it could be. As the night deepened, the Al-Mansour estate hummed with potential. Transformation was coming, not as a sudden revolution but as a carefully nurtured evolution, and at its heart were three unlikely allies: a businessman seeking redemption, a young woman who had discovered her purpose, and a boy whose imagination knew no bounds. The desert winds whispered of change, carrying with them the promise of a future yet unwritten. The morning of the community presentation dawned with an electric anticipation that seemed to vibrate through every corner of the Al Mansour estate. Months of planning, countless meetings, and passionate debates would culminate in this single moment. Rashid stood before a carefully selected audience of local community leaders, agricultural experts, potential investors, and regional government officials. Beside him, Zayn and Amira represented the heart of his vision, a living testament to the transformative power of education and innovation. For generations, Rashid began, his voice steady and compelling, our family has seen the date palm not just as a crop, but as a symbol of resilience. Like these trees that survive in the harshest conditions, our community must adapt, grow, and thrive. Zayn stepped forward, surprising everyone. At just 8 years old, he began to present the community education and agricultural innovation project he had been developing with Amira's guidance. His confidence was remarkable, his understanding of complex concepts far beyond his years. Our learning center won't just teach agriculture, Zayn explained, using a digital presentation he had helped create. It'll show how technology, tradition, and community can work together. We'll use solar-powered irrigation systems, develop drought-resistant date varieties, and create educational programs that give local children opportunities they've never had before. The room was silent, captivated by the young boy's passion and vision, but not everyone was supportive. Ahmad bin Khalid, Rashid's longtime advisor, stood up with a challenging expression. "This is madness," he declared. "You're risking the entire Al Mansour legacy on a child's dream and a servant's misguided ideas." The insult hung in the air. Amira felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Rashid stepped forward. "The true madness," he said quietly, "would be to ignore the potential of our people, to remain stuck in outdated thinking while the world moves forward." As the presentation continued, something extraordinary began to happen. Local leaders who had been skeptical started to lean forward, genuinely interested. Young agricultural engineers whispered excitedly about the innovative technologies proposed. Community representatives saw a vision of hope that went beyond mere economic opportunity. During a break, Amira found herself cornered by a group of local women. They were curious about her role, about how a young woman from a small village had become so integral to this ambitious project. "It wasn't about me," she told them. "It was about seeing the potential in Zayn, in this community, about believing that education can transform lives." Her words resonated deeply, creating ripples of inspiration throughout the room. But behind the scenes, tensions were brewing. Mrs. Fatima approached Rashid with a concerned expression. "Sir," she whispered, "there are rumors. Some of your traditional investors are planning to withdraw their support. They see this project as too risky." Rashid remained calm, but Amira could see the tension in his shoulders. Everything they had worked for hung in the balance. As the final presentation concluded, there was a moment of breathless silence. Then slowly applause began. First a few claps, then a growing wave of enthusiasm that seemed to sweep through the room. One by one, community leaders and potential investors came forward. They wanted to discuss partnerships, explore the proposed technologies, understand the educational programs. The Al Mansour vision was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a tangible reality. But the greatest moment came unexpectedly. An elderly community leader, respected throughout the region, approached Rashid. "Young man," he said, looking at Zayn, "your vision gives me hope for our future." Zayn looked up, surprised and touched. He reached out and took Amira's hand, then his father's, a simple gesture that symbolized the new family they were creating, the bridges they were building. As the event concluded, Rashid pulled Amira aside. "None of this would have been possible without you," he said softly. "You helped me see beyond my own limitations, helped me reconnect with Zayn, helped us reimagine what's possible." Amira felt tears pricking her eyes. The journey had been long and complex, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But standing there, Watching Zayn excitedly discussing the project with local engineers, she knew they had created something truly special. The desert wind outside seemed to whisper with promise. Change was coming, not as a destructive force, but as a nurturing, transformative power that could lift an entire community. As night fell over the Al Mansour estate, three people who had once been strangers now stood united. A father who had rediscovered his purpose, a young woman who had found her calling, and a boy whose imagination knew no bounds. The sun rose over the Al Mansour estate, casting a golden light that seemed to symbolize the transformation that had taken place over the past year. What had once been a traditional family business was now a beacon of innovation, community development, and hope. Zayn stood beside his father and Amira, watching as the first group of local students arrived at the newly established learning center. Children from various backgrounds, some from wealthy families, others from modest village homes, walked together, their excitement palpable. "I can't believe we actually did this," Zayn whispered to Amira, his eyes bright with wonder. Amira squeezed his hand. "We did this together," she reminded him. The journey had been long and complex, filled with challenges that had tested their resolve at every turn. Rashid approached, looking more relaxed than he had in years. The successful launch of their community education and agricultural innovation project had transformed not just the estate, but his entire perspective on business and family. "Mr. Hassan," Rashid called to the head tutor, "would you like to give the welcome speech?" But Mr. Hassan surprised everyone. "I think Zayn should do it," he said, a proud smile on his face. The rigid tutor, who had once insisted on strict traditional methods, had become one of their most enthusiastic supporters. Zayn stepped forward, his small frame belying the confidence that now radiated from him. As he began to speak about the Learning Center's mission, to bridge tradition and innovation to provide opportunities for all, Amira felt tears pricking her eyes. The day unfolded like a beautiful dream. Local farmers toured the new sustainable agriculture facilities, young students explored cutting-edge technology labs, community leaders discussed future collaborations. During a quiet moment, Rashid pulled Amira aside. "I owe you an apology," he said softly. "When you first came to work here, I saw you as just another employee. Now I realize you've been the catalyst for everything good that's happened to our family." Amira blushed. "I was just doing what I believed was right, for Zayn, for the community." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Fatima, who approached with an uncharacteristic softness. The once stern housekeeper had undergone her own transformation. "The board of directors is waiting," she said, but there was a hint of pride in her voice. As Rashid went to meet with the investors, Zayn turned to Amira. "What happens now?" he asked, a touch of uncertainty in his voice. "Now," Amira said, kneeling to his level, "we continue to learn, to grow, to dream." The afternoon brought an unexpected surprise. A group of international educators had heard about the Al Mansour Learning Center and wanted to study their innovative approach. Zayn proudly gave them a tour, explaining the integrated learning methods they had developed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the date palm groves, the estate seemed to hum with possibility. The transformation was complete, but it was also just beginning. That evening, a celebration dinner brought together everyone who had been part of this journey. Local farmers, international investors, community leaders, and estate staff sat together, sharing meals and stories. Zayn stood up, clinking his glass for attention. "When Amira first came to our home," he began, "everything changed. Not just for me, but for our entire community." The room fell silent, listening to the young boy's heartfelt words. Amira caught Rashid's eye across the room. They shared a moment of understanding. Two people who had once been strangers, now united by a shared vision. As the night wore on, the estate glowed with warmth and possibility. The date palms outside stood as silent witnesses to a transformation that went far beyond business, a transformation of hearts, of communities, of possibilities. And now, dear viewers, we invite you on this incredible journey. If this story of hope, innovation, and unexpected connections has touched your heart, we want to hear from you. Subscribe to our channel, Share your thoughts in the comments below and join us in celebrating stories that prove that true change begins with believing in each other. Hit that like button, share with your friends, and stay tuned for more inspiring tales that show how ordinary people can create extraordinary impact.